The GH5 is still one of the best cameras for video production on the market today. However, can it actually achieve a proper film look? Okay guys, I'm just going to interrupt really quickly to say please subscribe with notifications on if you haven't already. 97% of you currently watching are not subscribed, so please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. We upload every Friday and sometimes more. We do stuff on video production, music production, and anything in between. So if you haven't already, please subscribe, notifications on to be alerted when our new videos come out. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Sam. Of course, this week we are taking a look at the GH5 and asking the question, can it achieve a cinematic film look? The answer is yes, but there's a few things that you need to do to really get it as close to the film look as you can. Now we're specifically talking about the film look here today as opposed to just cinematic. Cinematic used to mean like cinema, but these days it's taken on a much more broad meaning, and a lot of people refer to cinematic as anything that's, you know, shot in slow-mo at 60 or 120, got add the black bars on top of the bottom, a bit more of an aggressive color grade and some artsy shots, and that's now cinematic. That is a massive pet peeve of mine. I'm going to do a whole video on the meaning of cinematic and the difference between that and the film look and why it annoys me, but also why it maybe isn't such a bad thing. So that's a whole nother video coming up. This is much more based on technical stuff, but I am also going to cover some contextual stuff as well, because I think it is important to understand the why as well as the what and the how. So firstly, as a disclaimer, I am by no means some kind of seasoned pro, but I have had a fair amount of experience, both doing a university course in video production, so I've had a lot of industry people come in and actually really show me the right way to do things, and I've also spent the last couple of years really learning the GH5, researching, understand its limitations, understand what it does really well, and figuring out, you know, what elements are needed to really achieve a film look, and I think I've got something that gets pretty close. So people often complain about the Micro Four Thirds mount. Now this mount's been around for a little while now, and it's a really versatile mount. It's probably one of the most versatile mounts out there, that and probably the Sony E mount. A lot of people get frustrated by the fact that the Micro Four Thirds mount has a 2x crop. And there's a lot of elitists out there that say you can only really get a cinematic look with something like a, you know, Sony a7 III or a7S II or something that has a full frame sensor, or at least an APS-C sensor. And because Micro Four Thirds has a smaller sensor, you can't get as good shallow depth of field, so therefore it's not cinematic. Well, firstly, shallow depth of field is not the be-all and end-all of the film look. It's part of it, but it's not the only thing. And secondly, you can absolutely achieve a shallow depth of field with the GH5 with just the right choice of lenses and adapters and that sort of thing. So if you really are discounting the GH5 because the sensor's too small, I think you're going to miss out, because actually the GH5 still has a lot of features that a lot of other similar mirrorless cameras don't actually have. If you watch any kind of video on how to get the film look or cinematic look, I think the chances are you will find someone who goes, well, actually it's more about the story. It doesn't matter what camera you have. You can shoot on a crappy old camcorder, and you know, that's much more cinematic than shooting something on a nice camera. And I get that, but also it's kind of a bit like, yeah, okay, shut up. I imagine anyone who's watching this is here to learn the technical way to actually achieve a film look with a camera like this. So I'm not going to go preaching that again. That's another video entirely. This is, you know, I'm going to mention some context, but I'm not going to start preaching going, oh yes, well it's much better if you use one of the, you know, this old camcorder because your story's better. It's like, yeah, okay, that's it kind of goes without saying, but you know, if you have a good story, you want it to look as good as possible, surely. So having at least a decent camera is still good. Anyway, that's, yeah, enough. Shut up, Sam. Okay, so basic camera settings, obviously. Switch the camera on first. First things first, you're going to want to make sure you have your camera set up properly. You need to decide whether you want to shoot in 1080p or 4K, and then select either 24 or 25 frames per second, depending on whether you're in a PAL or NTSC region. You can also use the 24Hz cinema frequency, but then you may run into flicker trouble with lights. The reason I'd either use 24 or 25 is just to make it a lot easier on, you know, shutter speed and that sort of thing, and don't have sort of flicker with kind of older lights, basically. I'll also say don't shoot at 50 or 60 frames a second unless you specifically mean to slow your footage down. Okay, so once you've set your resolution and frame rates, you then need to go into the menu and switch shutter operation to angle/ISO, and then keep it to 180 degrees. If you want to know what shutter angle means, I've included a link to an article down below, so I'm assuming anyone who watches this has a basic understanding of that. But 180 degrees is essentially 1/50 or 1/48 if you're shooting 24, but you know, 1/50 is close enough if you don't have shutter angle available on other cameras. This is basically what's used as a standard in film and television for the majority of productions. Sometimes for shots they may crank up the shutter just for action or stuff, but most of the time it will be essentially your shutter will be double your frame rate. Now if you are going to be switching sometimes to shooting slow motion and regular, angle is way better because it means it keeps a consistent shutter as opposed to having to keep adjusting the shutter every time you change your frame rate. So just keep it on 180 degrees and then don't worry. And then for the love of God, don't crank your shutter unless you have to. I personally, it's a pet peeve of mine. I can't stand it when people crank the shutter if it's too bright outside, and I'll get on to how to sort of solve that later in the video. So for picture profile, I personally just use the Cinelike D because I'm too cheap to pay for Vlog. Why would I pay for that? It should just come with the camera. It makes no sense to me, but it still works well. Still gives you sort of between 10 and 12 slots of dynamic range. I've got some profile settings here. I don't change too much, to be honest. I just turn the sharpness and contrast down a bit, and that does the job for me. That gives me enough control, but also doesn't mean I'm having to spend absolutely ages trying to grade everything. Lastly, you need to think about your aspect ratio. Now, obviously, most cameras will film in standard 16:9. A lot of people consider cinematic to be just add the sort of 235 or 239:1 black bars at the top and the bottom. You need to actually think about what your aspect ratio is, because you can shoot 4:3 and that still looks cinematic. But in the settings of GH5, there are some video guidelines, and you can actually just switch them on. That'll mean that you actually don't have to kind of keep adjusting your frame each time when you crop it in post. You know, you'll have already filmed, you know, within the right sort of proportions. So don't feel like you have to use 2.35:1. It is nice, but there's nothing to say that's, you know, 16:9 or like 2:1 or 185 or whatever. They all can look cinematic. But that being said, for me personally, I do like using, you know, 235 and 239:1. That's just my preference. But again, black bars on the top and the bottom do not equal the cinematic film look. Additional camera kit. This is again going back to the shutter speed. ND filter. You absolutely need an ND filter. I use the variable ones just because it makes it a lot easier. You do have to watch out a bit for color shift, and if you go too far, you know, dark, you'll get kind of crossing or uneven coverage. But I just find the variable ND filters are so useful in most situations. Whenever I use the ND filters, I am never adjusting shutter. I would actually sooner adjust the aperture than the shutter speed. I also enable extended ISO for outdoors if it's really sunny like it is today. Enable the extended ISO. You do lose a bit of dynamic range, but you get a really clean image. So I'll bring it down to 100 ISO if I need to, and then use the ND filter. And then as a last resort, I might, you know, close down the aperture a bit to maintain the 180 degree shutter, because that just looks a lot more natural than trying to crank the shutter for different shots. That's a lot more jarring. You may also find that you want to use, like, you know, rails and a cage and a matte box. Again, I don't have that sort of stuff at the moment. I find it works well without. The GH5 is quite good sort of handheld stuff. But, you know, if you want to use like a matte box or something and you know, use proper ND filters, then by all means do that. It'll also obviously keep out some of the flare as well. The one other thing I do have as well is I do actually have a battery grip, just a cheap third-party one on the bottom. Just gives me a little more stability and extra place to put my hands, because last thing I want to do is drop the camera, so it's nice to have a battery grip. And then obviously you can shoot for longer as well. Okay, so this is, for me, one of the biggest things that will affect your image. Obviously the GH5's got a great sensor, but I think there's a big thing about what lens you use. Now, a lot of the native Lumix lenses, they use focus by wire, which I'm not a big fan of. It's good if you want to do sort of select focus, or dare I say it, autofocus, which actually isn't too bad now with the latest firmware. But you'll also find they're quite sharp and they're quite clinical, and I find the native lenses are really great for most things. But if you want proper cinematic kind of, you know, fictional film production, like short film production, I wouldn't use the native lenses. I would use something else, basically. You know, focus by wire isn't good for trying to do focus pulls. It's not consistent. And you'll also find that a lot of the zoom and kit lenses that come with the GH5, they're like f3.5 to 5.6, which translates in full frame to, I think, well, f7 to sort of f11ish. So if you are trying to get a shallow depth of field, it's quite challenging. Ideally, in an ideal world, you would use sort of high quality cinema lenses, something like the Zeiss Primes or something, with a proper matte box and anamorphic, because obviously GH5 can do anamorphic, and that would be it. Go shoot with those. But obviously, you're talking about sort of several grand a lens, and even renting them is difficult. But if you have access to sort of proper cinema primes and, you know, like a speed booster, you're good to go. Use those, trust me. However, most of us budget filmmakers obviously can't afford that, and that means we'll end up using lenses designed more for photography. I know a big, very popular one is the Sigma 18-35, which is a nice lens. I just think it's still designed for photography, so it's still designed to be sharper, and it's still designed with an autofocus system in mind. So even if it's a mechanical autofocus system, still pulling focus in manual is not going to be great. You want something with a good sort of rotation for focus, at least 180 degrees, for sort of good sort of focus pull. And also, certainly of the footage I've seen, the 18-35 is great, but there's something about it that just still looks a bit clinical. It still looks like you've shot it with a photography lens. If you're a subscriber to this channel, this will come as no surprise, and it'll almost be an eye roll moment, but I think the best thing, if you're on a budget and you want some lenses that will give you a more kind of organic film look, I've got to say, vintage lenses is the way to go. And I've talked about this before. Yes, they are designed for photography, but they were made before everything was like super mass produced by machines and everything, and it's a little bit more kind of organic, and they've got a lot more imperfections, and just the optical quality is a lot more kind of naturalistic compared with this kind of older glass with, you know, a really new sensor. It gives quite a filmic look, certainly in my opinion, and you get a lot of character in the bokeh, and I think that's where a lot of cinematic images come from. And that, if you look at a lot of films, certainly sort of slightly older films, and anamorphic as well, a lot of the character of anamorphic lenses is in the bokeh, and while obviously these aren't anamorphic, something like this this 50mm Chinon, it does create this kind of sort of almost anamorphic quality in the bokeh, so I'd highly recommend these. The other thing really to talk about vintage lenses, again I mentioned this before, is they act like proper manual cinema lenses. So this one here has got sort of a focused rotation of 180 degrees. It's nice and solid, it's easy to turn, but it's also kind of, you know, got a bit of resistance, which is good. You got full manual control. I haven't declicked this because I don't want to risk breaking it. A lot of these vintage lenses are quite fast. A lot of the primes, you know, you get f1.9, f2.8, something like that. That's pretty fast. So I'd highly recommend those. And also they are dirt cheap, so you can buy loads of them, and a lot of them are really well made. Now I don't just use them on their own. You could just adapt them straight off and that'll look pretty good, but really you want to make the most of the fact that these are designed to cover the equivalent of a full frame. They're designed to cover full 35mm film. So, focal reducer, or speed booster if you got the money, but focal reducer, this one cost me 65 quid, and optically it's pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's still pretty good. And actually these lenses add a little bit of softness, which is what you get in the film look, because the film isn't tack sharp. It's got a bit of softness, it's got a lot of detail, but there's a bit more softness, and I think you can achieve a softer look in editing, but nothing beats getting it in camera. I am a firm believer of getting as much shot, and this is for everything. I'm a firm believer of getting as much in camera as you possibly can, because it just looks so much better and so much more natural. So this focal reducer, it's a times 0.7 reduction, so that turns the 2x crop into more like a kind of 1.4, 1.5 times crop, which is just a little bit bigger than Super 35, and then you start getting a much more Super 35 look, which, if you didn't know, up until recently, most films that were shot digitally or before on actual film, it was Super 35 size film or sensors. So that's coming a lot closer to that kind of look, that kind of traditional film look. Now, a lot of these days, you know, there's, you know, giant size sensors, you know, the ARRI LF is huge, but people are still using the Super 35. Super 35 format is still much loved, and you will find people use it a lot, especially in big productions. And as a last point with this focal reducer, it also means you will be able to take more advantage of the depth of field of these lenses as well. Additional grip. Now this is all kind of optional for the most part. The great thing about the GH5, and this is why this is specifically about the GH5 and not the GH5S or other cameras, is the stabilization in this camera is just unparalleled. So a lot of the time, I'll just shoot handheld. I don't use a lot of other grip equipment unless I feel like I really need to. When I shot my film Remain, we used the tripod for 2 or 3 shots at most. The rest of it was handheld. And the great thing is that the sensor shift is so good. You can set the focal length in the camera and have one of these old lenses, and it's still really stable. And you can actually emulate a lot of, you know, like dolly movements, you know, that sort of thing, just hand holding the camera. However, there are still some bits of kit I would certainly recommend, and first and foremost is a tripod. I'd recommend the Manfrotto 055 with the X Pro head, but basically any sort of sturdy tripod with a proper fluid video head, that'll do great. The second bit would be a slide track. I would always choose to use a slide track over a gimbal if I can. Dolly shots are used loads in films, like tracking, dolly, all that sort of thing. They use loads in films, and you'll notice a lot of the time it's more on a track than it is on sort of a gimbal or a Steadicam. And again, film still, even though film is still quite modern, they still use a lot of kind of analog techniques. And I think, again, analog, tripods quite, you know, tripods analog, sliders analog. Now the next one, I would recommend Steadicam or gimbal. Now, I do have a gimbal. I have, you know, I've got the Ronin SC, which is a great gimbal, but I use it sparingly. The only reason I don't have a glide cam or like a Steadicam is just, you know, the gimbal I use, you know, most of the time. I couldn't justify spending good money on a Steadicam at the moment, but if I had the money I would. So gimbals, I would suggest using minimally. People, you can always tell in a video when someone has just gone crazy with a gimbal. They're really easy to use and they are great, but after you've watched enough footage, you can always tell it's a gimbal, because for one thing, you know, you don't have anything to counteract the up and down motion. And there's something a bit too clinical about the way it moves. So if you use it sparingly, it can look great. But if you use it all the time, you get, I guess, what I'd call gimbal fatigue. So I think sticking to kind of, you know, more tripod, track dolly, you know, handheld, that sort of thing, I think is a lot better. And the last one, again, optional, it's just something I like to use, is a mini jib, which is literally just a big arm with a counterweight, and then you can move up and down. You can get some really great shots, very cinematic. You know, the rising shot is a really cool shot, and then if you attach a tripod head to the other end, you can actually get quite a lot of sort of you know, floating camera shots. So certainly something to look into. So when it comes to shooting, again, this is kind of talking about what you shoot as opposed to what you're shooting with. Lighting is huge. Alongside lenses, cinematic lighting or film lit lighting, that's going to make or break your film. Again, I could do a whole video on this, and there's tons of videos on how to do great lighting, like 3-point lighting and stuff. So I'm not going to kind of, you know, I'm going to brush over this because, you know, it's just such a big subject. If you don't know much about lighting, train yourself, teach yourself, research, and then come back. So my preference is to use natural lighting wherever possible, especially sort of diffused overcast lighting. That's always the best. And then just use something like a bounce if I just need a little bit more, you know, if a face is particularly shadowed. But natural lighting just works the best. Avoid flat lighting wherever possible. So I find something like, you know, one side, and then you've got more shadow and more definition on the face. I always find understated lighting to be the best. A good example of, you know, overlit things is if you look at some of these sort of YouTube kind of premium productions, they have overlit it to no end and it looks so fake. You really want to, I would always look at a room and just look at the lighting available and then just add little bits, and you just need to focus on, you know, draw the attention to sort of key areas. But more low-key lighting is a lot more kind of filmic and cinematic than sort of overlit, kind of overly produced stuff. So if you actually take a look at lighting and take a look at really well lit films, you'll find that lighting is actually very understated and very naturalistic, as opposed to just being sort of lots of lights and kind of a bit overdone. Okay, next up is angles. Again, not going to do a whole thing on this. Generally speaking, you want to obviously shoot at the character's eye level. Use a low angle to show a character is in power, high angle to show a character is sort of weaker. Those aren't hard and fast rules, but there's kind of, you know, general bits about it. Again, I am rushing past this. As with the lighting, I don't want to do a big tutorial, but, you know, consider angles, learn about that sort of thing, and again, that'll make a huge difference into how filmic your footage looks. And the last bit of shooting, as well as obviously what you shoot, story and everything, is movement. Now there's, again, this is preference, but I find it's a good example. You know, if you look at a lot of like student films, especially sort of when they're first starting out, everything's either overly handheld, or it's just everything's on a tripod and like awkward tripod shots. If you actually look at a lot of films, there's usually some movement going along, even if it's just a tripod panning around a little bit. But you'll often find in a lot of discussion shots, good example is Christopher Nolan films, in dialogue scenes, oftentimes the camera is very slowly doing a dolly move in, and that can make all the difference. Now, I like to have a lot of movement in what I shoot. I like to keep locked off tripod shots for very specific moments. Again, with the GH5, you can do handheld and it looks really natural, and as I said, you can emulate a lot of camera movements, and it's just a bit of practice and just getting really good at doing things slowly, and a lot of the sensor shift will cancel out a lot of like the micro movements that we get from doing handheld stuff. But again, with the way you move it, it's kind of more slow but deliberate movements. Anything that's kind of overly fast, unless it's for a specific shot, it looks a bit unnatural. It's the same thing with drone shots actually. If you're flying a drone and you have, the camera just suddenly tilting down like it's like a CCTV thing, it looks really weird. But if you have the camera moving forward and slowly tilting down, it looks a lot more filmic and cinematic. So every time I say cinematic, I'm just thinking of, your typical vlogger with 20,000 subs and like, oh, do you like my cinematic B-roll? And it's like, ugh, whatever. I'm such a snob. Okay, so now we're moving on to post-production. Now, there's just a few things I specifically want to cover here. I'm not going to cover how to edit or everything because I'm assuming you know how to edit. I'm going to be specifically talking about Premiere, but most of the things I discuss should be applicable in other NLE software as well. Once you've got your footage, you need to bring it all in and you need to set your frame size. So if you've shot for, let's say, 235 or 240 by 1, you need to actually set the frame size. Don't, for the love of God, add the matte bars on the top and the bottom. It looks awful. If it's for a specific, section, fine. But if your entire film is going to be in, 2 by 1 or 2.4 by 1, just actually set the frame size. It looks so much nicer and so much neater, and then you can always add those in later if you really feel the need to. So you want to go into sequence settings, and if you are going, let's just say we're going to go for a 2.4 by 1 ratio. In 4K it is 3840 by 1600, or in HD it's 1920 by 800, and that'll actually set the frame size. And it also means then if you're framing slightly off, you can just go into the motion tab and actually just adjust the height a bit so everything's in frame. Last bit is sort of grade and finalizing. So you finish your picture cut and everything's all good, doing the color correction, you need to add a look. Now, one thing I haven't tried, and I know it's supposed to be really good, is there is a LUT, which is supposed to make GH5 footage look a lot more like the Arial Alexa, especially with the highlights roll-off. I really want to try it. I've heard it's good, so, if you want to get that extra film look, then go for it, add that as well. My basic workflow is to, again, be understated. I used to, in the way I edited things, I always used to be really over the top with saturation and contrast, and it looked like a Michael Bay film, didn't look good. Although some Michael Bay stuff looks good. Anyway, so really all I do is a slight reduction in saturation, bump up the vibrance a bit, and then I'll add an S-curve with a flick on the bottom to preserve the shadows and also to add a little bit of a film fade sort of effect. And then at the last thing, I may also add a bit of a LUT just on low intensity if I want sort of a certain kind of colour look. Again, I'm glossing over this a lot because when I do a grade, I spend a lot more time in it, but I'd say it's, you want to be understated. Like film, if you look at film, most of the time it's moderately contrasty, but not like a crazy amount. There is definitely more contrast in there, and it tends to be quite vibrant and a reasonable amount of colour, but it's often slightly desaturated. Again, I'm not a massive expert on colour grading, it's just that's my observation. Final optional thing you can do is add some film grain at the end. For my film Remain, I added some 4K 35mm film grain and then adjusted the opacity on blend mode. I added a bit of contrast as well, so it was really you could really see the film grain. But yeah, you can find free film grain on YouTube, or just look for it. You'll find a little free film grain which you can then just layer over the top. It looks nice, but you don't have to do that. And then when it comes to exporting, if you don't want your film grain to suddenly go all mushy, you need to set the bitrate really high, because otherwise it will lose that detail. So there you have it. That is kind of hopefully a sort of reasonable tutorial on how to achieve a cinematic film look with the GH5. If anyone has any tips on how to improve the way I've done things, or if there's anything I skipped over that you'd like me to sort of talk about, I'll happily do so. Ultimately, if you're trying to achieve a film look, there are better cameras if that's what you mostly want to achieve. So I'd probably say something like the Blackmagic 4K Pocket or like the Zcam E2 are around the same price point. They've got more dynamic range, and the way the color science works is much more geared towards kind of, red and airy. However, the GH5, compared to its competitors, like A7 III and some of the Canon cameras, I'd argue that it's as good as, if not better in some cases, for achieving this look. It certainly can achieve, you know, pretty close. I think there are just a few things though which you can't really control, especially in just the way it reproduces motion. There's something about the way it does it that I can just tell it's GH5, and maybe I've just gotten so used to it. And it's the same with the way the colours are reproduced. Like, it looks good, but just I'm like, I know that's a GH5. But for the most part, the majority of people who see it, and if you really spend a long time trying to make it look filmic, it will look filmic. So yeah, GH5 absolutely can. There are better camera choices for, you know, cinematic film look, but the GH5 can absolutely achieve it pretty damn well. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. I think I'm going to do more videos sort of in this series and on this topic, so look out for those. If you haven't subscribed, please do, with notifications on, and we will see you in the next one. Goodbye.